This tutorial is just to demonstrate how to tink back stitches when you're working with knit stitches and knit two together stitches and yarn overs. So when you're tinking, instead of taking your stitches off your needle and just ripping back, you're actually removing the previous stitch that was knit. So you're shifting the knitting around your needles back to the left and taking out one stitch at a time, basically unknitting the stitch that you made. And so because I'm an English knitter, I do find it easier to tink with the yarn being controlled by my right hand. You can do this with the yarn being controlled with your left hand. It's just because if you knit continental, if you tension your yarn in your left hand, when you're tinking, controlling the tension is not going to be quite the same. So basically what you're going to do is you're going to pull on your working yarn in such a way that it opens up the stitch underneath the stitch that's on the needle. So here I have my stitch on the needle. All right, so use my pointer maybe. So here I have my stitch on the needle where the needle is going through the loop of yarn here. But if I tug on my working yarn a little bit and kind of pull down on my project, see if I can do this. I need like 3 hands, but so if I tug on my project downward toward myself and I tug on my working yarn away from myself, what it does is it opens up the hole in the previous stitch, the stitch that this stitch on the needle was knit into. And so what I can do is I can put the tension on the working yarn and then insert my left needle into that hole underneath the stitch. So you're basically watching where the yarn comes into the stitch. And once you insert your needle into that, you can simply remove the current stitch off of the right needle and just tug the yarn. And so you've unknit one stitch. And you would simply continue along with each stitch, making sure that it's moving all the way onto the right needle. Now, I find it easiest to, first of all, mark where I want to tink to. So rather than counting stitches or something like that, I like to mark where I want to stop tinking. So I'm going to actually tink back 2 sections here. So I've got a section into my stitch marker and a section until my next stitch marker. So I'm actually going to put a stitch, it's a locking stitch marker on the cable right next to the stitch marker that I'm wanting to get back to. And so all I have to worry about is unknitting stitches until I get to my locking stitch marker. As I said, I find it easier to control the working yarn if I'm holding it in my right hand, and that could just be because I'm an English knitter. But when I do this, I basically tension the yarn between my hand and the needle here, and then I just insert my index finger underneath the working yarn, so that tension is being held right here, and that gives me positive tension away from myself on the working yarn. And then I can use my left hand to tug the fabric toward me to help open up that hole, and then use my left hand to insert the needle into the stitch I want to undo. And then I can just pull the working yarn out. So far all I've done is tink back knit stitches. Now I'm to a knit two together. So if you look really carefully here, there are actually, if you look at the yarn, I'm just going to kind of pull this on the needle away from the other stitches. So the yarn here is going into not 1, but 2 stitches. So if you look back here, you'll see 2 stitches wrapped over this working yarn. So I've got my working yarn coming through both of these stitches. So when I have that on my right needle, if I'm tensioning the yarn out, I can actually pull that hole open, and I just want to make sure that my left needle is going into both of those stitches. So now I have 2 stitches on my left needle that yarn is coming through, and then I can just slide my right needle out of that stitch and then just pull the working yarn out of both of those stitches. And now I'm to a yarn over. So yarn over is just really easy. You just bring it off of the right needle until you have the working yarn just coming to the next stitch. Okay, so again, a knit 2 together. So I'm going to do this one with my left hand, just if that helps, if you're more left-handed. So again, you just want to kind of look to open up the stitches that the yarn is going through. So you should be able to pull in such a way on the fabric towards you and then the stitch away from you so that you can get your needle into that hole and underneath both of those stitches. And then simply bring that off of the right needle and then just tug on the working yarn and it'll pop out of the stitches. Then to remove the yarn over, simply bring the working yarn to the back. All right, to another knit 2 together. So again, I'm just tugging on that fabric toward me, looking that left needle into the hole under both of those stitches. All right, so I can see back here, I've got 2 stitches wrapped around this working yarn here, and then all I have to do is pull that working yarn out. So you can do this as slowly as you need to, just gradually moving, basically a stitch at a time. When you move the yarn, or when you move the knit 2 togethers, it's going to be 2 stitches at a time basically. But you're basically working to get each stitch off of the right side and back onto the left side. Get the working yarn pulled out. All right. So then when I get to my stitch marker, I just slip it back over to the left. So all this is doing is just removing 1 stitch at a time, backing up in the knitting to whatever spot you want to start over again from. Try to do this with my left hand again. So open up the stitch, insert the left needle into that stitch, make sure it's all the way up on the needle, and then just pull the working yarn out. Okay. And again, I just find this easier to control if I don't know if you can see that really well, but I basically grab that yarn so it's coming underneath my fingers up against that needle, and then I'm just putting tension on it with my index finger on my right hand, using that to pull away from me, and then I can use my left hand to pull the fabric toward me to open up each of those holes. So open up a hole, insert the left needle, pull the yarn out. Then open up the hole. So this is another knit 2 together, so I can kind of stick my needle in there and then rotate it toward me to make sure I've got both of those stitches over the needle before I pull my right needle out, and then pull the working yarn out of that. And then I have a yarn over, so I'm just going to bring that around. So from the front of the needle back to the back, so that my working yarn is, again, just tensioned back here. I've got another knit 2 together. So insert that there. Bring the working yarn off. And you can readjust as many times as you need to tension down the working yarn so that what you have to pull on, you're not having to pull your hand like really far away from you. You're working very up close here. So one more knit 2 together. So again, I'm just tensioning the yarn away from me, tensioning the working yarn away from me to open up that hole. And then I'm also working tension toward myself on the fabric to open up that hole. And I'm just looking into that space that's being created where the stitch is actually opening up. Again, I need a third hand to do this really well. But as I tension the fabric toward me and the working yarn away from me, it's pulling open the hole where I need to insert my needle to get into the stitch. And so those knit two togethers, they're basically stacked like this around the working yarn. And so if you can get your needle just following the path where the yarn went in to make the new stitch, you can get them both onto your left needle like that, and see both of them on the needle, and then just pull your right needle out of the stitch and then pull the yarn out. And that's all there is to it. When you're doing different stitches, like if you were doing a slip knit or something like that, it is a little bit more difficult to tink back those stitches because they're oriented on the needle differently. But so I have another stitch here, and it really helps to keep your stitches kind of pushed up toward the tip of you don't want to push them all too much, but I find it's nice to have a clump of stitches that are pushing the stitches that I need to get off closer to the tip of the needle and not have them quite so spread out here. The slower you do this, the less likely you are to lose any stitches. Okay, so into that stitch. So again, I've got two, and knit two together right here. So pull that off of the right needle. So that loop, just let it come off the right needle, and then just pull that working yarn out, and then pull this was a yarn over. And so to get that off, I just need to unwrap it from the needle. And then I'm here to my stitch marker, which tells me I've tinked back to the part where I want to stop. And then from here, I can just work back forward like I'm starting where I wanted to start from again. So as long as you know where you're starting from again, you can just pick it up and begin knitting like nothing happened. So one other thing that I think might be helpful is just how to read your stitches. So they're going to look a little bit different if they're down on the cable than when they're on the needle. So I want to kind of talk about both. So in around where you've just worked a yarn over, finding your yarn overs next to your stitches can be pretty simple. If you look on the front, your yarn overs are going to lean at a different angle. So your knit stitch is going to kind of lean to the right, and your yarn overs are going to kind of lean to the left. If you look at the back, your yarn overs will be open back here, whereas your knit stitches, whether they're a regular knit stitch or a knit two together, are going to have a little collar around them, a wrap around the bottom of the stitch. So I can look at the back of my work and I can tell I have a yarn over here because it's open and it's coming down into the next stitch from over the top here, whereas this stitch is going underneath a wrap. So I have a yarn over and I have a knit stitch, I have a yarn over, I have a knit stitch, I have a yarn over, I have a knit stitch. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about whether that's regular knit or knit two together, but you can look at the back of your work here and read your stitches really easily. Yarn over, knit, yarn over, knit, yarn over, knit, yarn over, knit, yarn over, and then knit, 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 knit. And when you look at the front of your work, come back to the front of the work, if you can identify these knit stitches, you can also identify whether you're knitting into one stitch, for instance here, because the yarn that's coming up over the stitch and kind of behind it, you've only got one stitch wrapping that, whereas here you clearly have two stitches wrapping that stitch. Yarn over comes over into the next stitch that's wrapped with two stitches coming behind it. Basically a wrap coming here and then a wrap coming here. And come over to this next stitch. So I've got this yarn over, it's just coming over the needle at that. Remember the yarn overs are leaning to the left, the knit stitches are leaning more to the right or straight up. And then I've got this knit stitch here, and again, If I follow down into that, I can see that there's 2 wraps going around that stitch, so that's a knit 2 together, yarn over, knit 2 together, yarn over, knit 2 together, and then here I've just got a regular knit stitch, just the 1 wrap coming behind it. So if I like to think of it as like, if this is the neck of your stitch, the little collar going around it, I've only got 1 collar, whereas these stitches over here have a double collar. They're like those 80s kids that wore the 2 polo shirts for some reason. So if you can read your stitches, it'll really help to be able to go back and figure out, you know, did I start with a yarn over? Did I knit the first stitch, or did I accidentally do a knit 2 together here? So if you can start to read your stitches, it'll go a long way toward figuring out if you actually have an error or if you're just, so sometimes a yarn over can get caught, like as your stitches get pushed together, yarn overs can get caught on top of other stitches to the point where it looks like you just have 1 stitch. I'm trying to fake it here, so it's not going to be quite as much as when you're actually counting, but sometimes it looks like, okay, so I just have a yarn over here. But if you can tease the stitches apart, oh, nope, it turned out there's a yarn over and a knit stitch there. So if you're looking at your stitches up on your needle, it's not going to be quite as obvious, just because the yarn overs will tend to lean less than they do once you get them down onto the cable. But you should still be able to tell which stitches are coming actually out of a collar from a previous row and which stitches aren't. So this I know is a yarn over because it doesn't have a collar around it, and this I know is some kind of knit stitch because it does. Yarn over, knit stitch, yarn over, knit stitch, yarn over, knit stitch, and then all these are going to be knit stitches because they each have collars. And then you can see back here I've worked those yarn overs from the previous row because they do have collars around the back of them. But if I were to work this row, so for instance, this row that I just worked, you can kind of see on the where I just worked the yarn overs that the yarn overs slightly lean, but it's really hard to tell the difference for it between, for instance. So if I kind of spread these stitches out on the needle, you can kind of tell where the yarn overs are. They do lean a little bit more, while the knit stitches tend to be more straight up and down. Okay. But you really got to kind of tug that fabric down to be able to tell which of your knit stitches are a regular knit 1 and which are knit 2. So if I tug this down here, maybe really need a third hand. If I tug this down here, I can see this stitch right here is going into 1 and then a second collar. Same thing with this knit stitch here. This has 2 collars around it, 1 back here and then 1 here. Same thing right here, coming around the needle and then into this collar. And then as I spread these stitches out, you can see the yarn overs kind of lean more to the left. And again, you can always come to the back of your work to see yarn over, knit, yarn over, knit, yarn over, knit, yarn over. Remember, the yarn overs are going to come around the back of the needle and then go over the stitch below, as opposed to coming underneath and having that stitch form a little collar around the back of the stitch. So finding your yarn overs on the back of the work is going to be really easy, whether you're on whether your stitches are on the needle or if they're on the cable here, because those yarn overs will come down over the needle and then over the collar of the stitch next to it. All right, so they're kind of floating out here in empty space on the back. So all that to say, if you can read your stitches, it'll go a long way toward being able to figure out whether you have, did I work this section correctly? Did I start with a yarn over? And then when I knit that first stitch, did I just knit one or did I knit two? So all of that, I hope, is helpful to being able to figure out where you are in your stitches, and then to be able to get back to the section that you need to in order to start and move forward again with the correct stitch count. So I hope that helps.